Launching a new company is really hard, but scaling up a small company is even tougher. Going from 10 employees to 1,000 means a more complex organizational structure, bigger risks, and the challenge of translating a startup culture into corporate values. So what does a new venture need to compete in the big leagues? And what are the characteristics of startups that scale up successfully? Welcome to The Big Question, the monthly video series from Chicago Booth Review. I'm Hal Weitzman, and with me to discuss the issue is an expert panel. Michael Alter is a clinical professor of entrepreneurship at Chicago Booth. He was formerly the CEO of the Thai Bar, and before that, co-founder, president, and CEO of Sure Payroll. Amanda Lannert is CEO of Jellyvision, which makes interactive software that helps employees choose health insurance and retirement plans. And Jay Shekhawat is the founder and former CEO of Fieldglass, a software provider that helps large companies manage staffing, consulting, and other projects, and which was acquired by SAP in 2014. Panel, welcome to The Big Question. Michael Alter, let me start with you. Just give us an overview. What are the toughest challenges facing an entrepreneur and a company when they're scaling up from, say, 50 employees above 50?
Sure. And how, one of the interesting things about startups in general and making that change is that it depends a little bit. So not one size fits all. But I think in general, there's a few areas that we see as a challenge. One is, once you start to scale up, your business changes completely from maybe building a product business to a distribution business. And it's all about distribution is how you scale, whether that's sales or other aspects of making your product and getting it out the door. So distribution is one big one. I think a second one is all around the people. Do you have the right people? How are you, changing out the people that you have? And then the role of the CEO as the leader has to change as well. So those are kind of two pieces of the puzzle there. One of the other ones that people sometimes forget, but it's critically important, is cash. It's expensive to scale. Mm-hmm. And if you run out of cash, it's a real problem. And then I think the last one that we see and that people struggle with is this need for sort of process, structure, rules. Maybe it's mission and vision. And in that one, it's sort of like asking somebody when you run without it to show up to play a sporting event or a game, and they show up on the field, but you don't tell them the rules. And so you really need to make sure that you have a set of rules that everybody understands so they know how to play the game as you scale.
Right. Okay. Amanda, does that sort of chime with your experiences at Jellyvision?
Absolutely. I think there's a real fundamental shift between 40 and 50 that has more to do with how you change. You usually get to 40 to 50 employees because you're very good at doing. And suddenly you need to become good at leading, which is a fundamentally different skill set. It's the rise of managers. It's the rise of need to
you
communicate.
Put that difference at about 40 to 50 employees.
In my experience, that's when it just starts to be you can't run in lockstep anymore, and you need to start to build systems and processes for communication instead of just everybody. It went without being said, and now it's not only said and written down between 40 and 50 employees.
Okay. And Jay, I know that in your company, you had sort of not problems, but challenges, some of the same challenges earlier on, well before that 50 people mark, because of some of the structures that you put in place. Tell us about that.
We did. So most tech firms these days need to have an offshore strategy just so they can offset some of the costs. And I think when we had 4 or 5 employees in the States, we already had offshore development, 15, 20, 30 people overseas. And to the points that Amanda made, you add 2 other challenges, and one of them is the issue of geography. So you're separated by 10.5 to 11.5 hours of time, so you have a coordination problem. And the second is culture, because the group overseas, especially where we chose in India to place this group, they marched to a very different drummer from us. So it took us a while to get the cultures coordinated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you lose sort of line of sight management, right? And Jay lost it early. Whereas I think in Amanda's case, once you can't sort of cover everybody from your office when you look out the door or from your desk, that's when you have to start to manage in a different way.
And something that I know you teach our starting out entrepreneurs here at Chicago Booth is that when they start out, they have to do everything for themselves. They have to be the sales department and the marketing department and everything else. But what are the different types of skills, or who are the entrepreneurs that make it through that transition successfully? What kind of characteristics or behaviors do they display?
Well, I think they're adaptive people, and they're able to learn from their mistakes. I think the other one is, in some ways, while entrepreneurs have an ego, they are comfortable enough to bring in people that have more experience than them, that might be smarter than them. And a lot of them really realize that their job as CEO is to make the company successful, as opposed to do everything. to be successful themselves. And that's a real transition that people have to be comfortable making.
Okay, Amanda Lannert, did your behavior change, do you think, when you hit that 40 to 50 break point that you talked about?
Absolutely. I was project management and business development and sales and recruiting at Jellyvision up until a certain point. And then you start to hire people who are functionally better at any role than you were good at every role. And you have to really understand your job shifts from getting things done yourself to being able to attract, retain, motivate, direct, inspire people to do various jobs. And it's a different skill set, and I think a different way to prioritize
Was there
your
a
time and day.
moment when you suddenly realized you're going to have to change your behavior?
It's almost a snowball effect versus like on Tuesday you wake up and have clarity. But I'll tell you, the one bit of advice, everyone says not to do it. I did it anyway, and it's definitely a mistake, is in that moment when you realize I need help in managing, I need help in communicating, I need help in keeping everyone in lockstep. Do not go into every department and promote your best performer into management. Really understand that there is a difference between doing and managing, not just within the CEO, but within everybody else. Professional management is a skill set. We did take our best doers and put them in positions of management. It took a couple years to unwind that, to say there's a difference between leadership and management. And you really need to start to understand that around 50 employees.
Okay, so how did you overcome that? You just brought in people who you thought were more leadership type material?
Pattern recognition. When you start to see things going wrong, I spent a lot of time in the community talking to more successful CEOs who had bigger companies, trying to figure out what did you get right. And also you look for pockets within your own company of where is it working and why. And then how can we sort of repeat that in multiple departments? A lot of trial and error, and I have the scars to prove it.
Okay, Jay, do you have a story about sort of how learning about how to become a leader of a big company as opposed to?
I've got a couple of stories, but I'll follow up on Amanda's point. In the early days, I always thought of a good employee as being a Swiss Army knife of human beings. You know, they have all these different tools, and you can apply them. A skilled generalist. My favorite story of learning that you need specialization is when we hired our first real head of QA. Before that, QA used to consist of beer and pizza parties, and you just bang away at the product on a Friday night and catch as many bugs as you can. And this gentleman came in and he says, "This is idiotic." You know, he was GE Black Belt Six Sigma trained and all that, and he said, "You cannot treat quality assurance as a screen at the end of the development process. You've got to treat it as something you build in at every step." And so I looked at him as, where have you been all my life? And it was my transition moment from generalist to specialist.
Yeah. I think I have a mentor who said it, I thought, really well, which is business is really a movie. And while the themes are really the same, sometimes the plot's a little different. But once you've seen the movie, there's real value. And the issues you have around HR, the issues you have around distribution, around scaling, are very similar across businesses. So finding somebody who's seen the movie is really helpful. And when you get somebody who's seen the movie, it's magical.
And sometimes, Michael, also it turns out to be a bit of a horror movie. Mm-hmm. Not all firms are able, or most firms are not able to make that leap from 50 employees to 1,000 or whatever. Mm-hmm. There's a real bottleneck there, both in terms of funding and just in terms of success, who survives. So what are the classic mistakes that entrepreneurs make that don't enable them to get through that hurdle?
Right. Well, there are a number of them, but one of the biggest ones, if we can continue on with the movie analogy for a minute,
please.
Is that you're in pain and you're struggling and you almost feel like your business is going to implode. Because when we tell the story of a business, it's often up and to the right and how successful it is, but the reality is it's much more like a heartbeat. And so in those points when you're down and you're scared if your business is going to survive and you need somebody to plug in your hole as the head of sales or the head of customer service, you tend to look for somebody with that skill set and that experience. And the problem is if they are not the right kind of actor to fit your role, they don't have that right cultural fit, it's a much bigger disaster. And so a lot of times you feel and you see this sort of rejection of new executives when you try to bring them in. And a lot of it has to do with they've got the great functional skills, they've seen the movie, but they just aren't the right cultural fit.
Okay, so culture is one. What else?
I think one of the other ones is realizing that you've got to turn from focusing on a set of customers that got you here is usually not the set of customers that will get you there. We all hear about in the technology world early adopters. And most of your customers are probably early adopters. A lot of them have found you in some way. They've put up with some of your bugs and your scars a little bit. And now it's time to turn to somebody who's expecting a little bit more of a finished product, and what works to get at them is usually very different than what got you there, and you need to make that transition.
I'll chime in on that. I think it's really important to remember it's not what you've done, it's what you can do. And having history and pattern recognition can help you be a more effective operator. But a lot of times you could be on a winning team and be an under contributor, or be an amazing contributor at a company that was just going downhill despite your valiant efforts. So really it's important to start with a very clear job description where you just describe your company, what you value, how you like to work, so that people interested can lean in. It's the most important marketing a company in early stage probably ever will do, is writing a good job description. Get people who would be attracted to lean in, and then really, really get to know the person, their DNA. There's nothing as valuable in this time in business as being an adaptive self-learner. The job will change, the product the person is working on will change, the economy will change. Really, there's no rinse and repeat. You were successful then, use the exact same playbook and be successful again. And it's so tempting for a startup who's trying to de-risk, who just wants it to be easier to say, please bring in your playbook and let's hope and assume it'll work. It doesn't. So you need to have someone who's still got the grit, the resilience, the perspective to be able to be on their feet and adapt, rather than a company assuming because it worked then, it will work in the same way now. That's a myth.
And have you seen, you're involved in the startup entrepreneurial community, have you seen examples of people who selected the wrong people and it actually kind of dragged the business under?
I've done it. Everyone's
We've all
done
done
it.
it,
It seems
So tell
on
us about
paper
how
a great
how did you
idea.
learn from that? Well, I mean,
Yeah, the whole thing is, do not become enamored by a resume. If I'm hiring someone mostly because I'm impressed with a resume, it's not the right hire. I need to be most impressed with how we start to brainstorm in an interview, most impressed by their curiosity, are they a great question asker, most impressed by how they build relationships. I cannot be impressed by the resume. That is a mistake that I make multiple times in hiring, where I overweight the resume versus other reads and characteristics and feedback you can get throughout an interview process.
so is that to you the biggest mistake that people make, is just hiring the wrong people?
Yeah, or just not following the process. Like, I really try to look at a resume late, and I know that sounds crazy because resumes are a really important description of what people have done. But for us, I look heavily at the cover letter. I'll look more at a LinkedIn profile, try to figure out if we have shared connections, deeply back channel reference, and then spend a lot of time in conversation throughout an interview process. That is how I should be making my decisions, not relying on a resume to say, this will work.
But to you, that's the key to success in this case?
Yes.
Okay.
And CEOs spend an awful lot of time finding the right people for right now. That's a huge part of the job.
Does that mean that the more, if you continue to have success, you continue to grow, you need to continue to review your staffing and maybe have to get rid of people who have not made the transition with you?
Michael said it, what got you here will not get you there. And our executives regularly have conversations about how tiring it is to be elastic all the time, but that's the regime. Structures break, processes break, expectations break over and over. And you just have to be adaptive and assume whatever was a good groove for the last 6 months is going to need to be revisited and potentially rebuilt from the ground up when you're in a high growth environment.
Yeah, and if you're really growing, you have to assume that that's going to happen faster and faster. So just as the CEO, when you get comfortable, it's time to change again. Because otherwise it's too late.
Well, the thing to keep in mind, to Amanda's point, is that the resume is a marketing document. It's not the equivalent of a material data spec sheet where you describe an item with its chemical composition. That's a true document. The resume is a marketing document. And the thing to look for, the thing that I would look for is attitude, and then a core set of skills, and then a demonstration of how you contributed those skills to the last few places you worked at. With attitude being heavily overweighted. That's what you're looking for. My second point is, when you pull a group of talented people together, it doesn't tell you how they will work with each other. And the flip side of diversity, because we brought in a lot of very people from different ethnicities, both genders and so on, and it works really well in the long run, but in the short run it creates a coordination problem as to how we all work together. And I think the thing you have to do is focus everybody on the third thing, which is the thing you're building outside of all of the individuals, and make sure we all understand we are co-authors of this thing that we're building, and no longer individual contributors. So I think if you get that right, then the diversity just sort of bakes you a better cake, so to say.
Right, and I think it's the CEO's role to make that cake mix work. Right. And so that means you have to change how you're behaving because you drive how all of that gets together. And so one of the other challenges is making sure you're really looking at what are the things you're choosing to do, and more importantly, what are the things you're choosing not to do anymore, because that sets the tone for everybody else.
That's very true. So to that point, I decided I'm not going to think about my weaknesses because it's going to take me forever to ever fix them. I don't have enough time in my life. I'm going to take the one or two things I'm good at and only do those things, and then hire, to the things that I can. I'll give you a quick anecdote on this. It was a Friday night one time, and I'm interviewing this lady who's a tax specialist, and I really liked her. I didn't understand most of what she said, but at the end of it, I felt comfortable enough. We offered her the job, and I said, "What draws someone to what you do? And God bless that you do it, but what draws you to it?" And she says, she looks back, she says, "Jay, do you know what my idea of a good time is on a Friday night?" She says, "I pour myself a glass of wine and I pull down the latest IRS tax regulations and I read them."
Wow.
And then she proceeded to lay out the architecture of the tax code in a way that was actually remarkable. I really got interested, and I sort of understood another 5-10% more.
That's cool. That's
But
passion.
It's passion.
That's cool.
It's passion, and she saw something. She made it so interesting, and that's what you're looking for. I will never be 1% as good at what she does as she was.
Anything can be interesting and important if you work with people who have curiosity and passion, though. It's just proof like anything can be interesting.
That is a remarkable story. I wonder how many people read the IRS code for fun. Over a glass of wine maybe tempers some of the harsher points there. But I was going to ask you, there's a lot of advantages in the culture of a startup, and all of you pointed to that. When you start growing, and maybe growing very fast or faster and faster, how do you maintain that culture of, people that you get in a startup, of people diving in and helping other people when they don't necessarily need to, or being innovative and being entrepreneurial and problem solving? How do you maintain that when things are bigger, when you're spread over various different countries?
Well, one point I'll leverage what Amanda said earlier is the thing that you guys said, the thing that you did earlier. There's a lot of fire drills in the early stage startup, and it's the heroic save, it's the diving catch, and you look good because you saved the client. That does not scale, and you have to in fact cut out those things and stop rewarding behaviors, the diving catch behavior, because often people will sort of set their own fire and then be the fireman, and then you discover that later, not intentionally, but you want to create sort of a duller, repeatable process where there's more discipline. It sometimes takes a little bit more time, but more process. It's the balance between the diving catch and then the team that got you to that, to be in a good position to take that catch.
But is process the enemy of a startup culture? I guess that's what I'm asking.
It's a balance. It's not the enemy. Too much of it will kill you, but this is where the CEO needs to, it's a fine art between how much process we have and what we don't.
Yeah, to me, again, it's back to the giving the rules to the game. Because there are people that, if you think about basketball as an example, that make unbelievable shots in how they do it, but they do it within the rules that they know that they can't travel. And so making sure that you have rules gives people the structure to then be so much more successful and to be themselves.
Sure. Amanda?
I really strongly agree. Process isn't bad. Bad process is bad. Just like management isn't bad, bad managers are bad. These are incredibly helpful tools and constructs for a group of people to be productive at scale.
But I'm just thinking that sometimes people can cling to process in a way that well beyond that process being productive or useful or efficient.
So let's bring it back to culture. To me, culture isn't an ethos. It isn't a feeling. It's to do. It's behavior. It's how you get stuff done. What do you tolerate? What makes you laugh? How do you celebrate? It's rituals around behavior. And I think to protect culture as you grow, it's a myth that it really is always top down. It's not. It largely becomes the people that you have. So who do you hire? Who do you retain? Who do you promote? Who do you put on a plan? And it's the treatment of the people. The rituals of culture change. The rituals of celebration change with scale. As people stop being 4 people in a room, it becomes 40 people in a room, 400 people in dozens of rooms. The rituals change, but the ideas behind them don't. And it all comes down to, do you hire a tribe of people who are aligned or not?
And I think some of it also is a commonness among the language that you adopt that creates your culture. You know, Amanda, you have, I think it's called the Schmutz test?
The
Or
Schmutz Pact, yeah. We
Schmutz Pact,
storytell,
right.
yeah. We're storytellers.
And the way that you do that
What
really
is that?
drives
Just
the
tell us
culture.
what that is.
So instead of saying, you should give feedback, you should give feedback, you should give feedback, you need to speak up, we hire you because you have an opinion, it's important. Instead, we just say this. Have you ever been to lunch with someone and noticed they have a little bit of food in their teeth? You know, and then finally you're like, hey, you got a little something. What does that person say? Thank you.
Right.
Or why didn't you tell me earlier? Why? Because nobody wants schmutz on their face. Giving feedback is kind.
So you call
Not
it the schmutz?
the Schmutz Pact. So we say, give feedback in the moment because it's kind, because nobody wants schmutz on their face. So instead of saying, you have a moral imperative to speak up, we just say, hey, Schmutz Pact, let's have a conversation. And it helps us grow and it helps us get better.
Okay.
I want to make a comment on your process point. I think of process as an algorithm for behaviors. It's a behavioral algorithm. It's a set of steps. And it's just like with any algorithm, they run their course and then they have to be shut down or killed off. And so in my mind, and I never did this in the moment, I can say this with the wisdom of many scars, is that your collection of processes, which is your schedule of meetings, how long they run, who's in them, they should all be considered living things that don't deserve to live a moment more than they are necessary. And so the CEO in their mind should have a sense of the collection of processes that are, enabling their firm. It's behavioral algorithms.
Michael Olds, you talked earlier about the question of distribution. Talk a little bit more about that. What is the challenge?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges when you're starting a business, you're trying to figure out, most people talk about product market fit, right? Will the dogs eat the dog food? And I think that that's true and it's important. The challenge is once you get a point where you have that, then the challenge is how do you get people to buy more of that? And the biggest way you do that is they got to know about you. And so how do you get that distribution, whether it's through a channel, whether it's through a direct sales force, whether it's through marketing? And that's the thing that really people struggle with because it's very hard to build a very scalable distribution channel quickly. It's one of the reasons why so many of the big tech companies acquire great little companies that have product market fit and then they stick it into their sales channel and boom, it's a big business. And so how do you do that and how do you create this replicable, scalable, repeatable process? Because it's so different than the first process, right? That was, I don't really know, I got to figure it out. And so I need people that figure stuff out. And now I need a process where people actually have to do the same thing over and over again. And the people that like to figure stuff out don't like to do the same thing over and over again and vice versa. And so it's a real challenge to think through that and it can be very expensive, especially if you scale too quickly.
And Jay, I mean, your company was bought out exactly in the way that Michael describes, right? Presumably to bring a lot more distribution. What were the challenges you had before that buyout?
So Michael's point of distribution is an interesting one because it varies greatly depending on what the conduit is that is already selling into the place you're selling. So in our case, we could have partnered with the large consulting firms and we tried that. That didn't work. And we tried to go directly initially and that didn't work because IT is blocking it. We found out that we could piggyback off of the larger staffing organizations and provide the software. So it became a co-sale. So not a resale, but a co-sale. And then eventually we were able to get into pole positions where the customers asked us to come. So the distribution landscape is a battle landscape, for the amount of sort of premium that is being fought over in the distribution channel. And so once we figured it out, it is the greatest experience ever because the day you figure it out, you're able to step back and look at this thing you created, which previously resembled a collection of Jenga blocks, and you say, this isn't falling. This is actually running on its own. And that's a great moment. That's when you know you have a scalable model.
Amanda, what were the challenges you had in distribution and how did you tackle them?
Well, I think about it as in simple blocks. It goes from sort of the founder CEO sale to having someone else in the organization sell to having a repeatable process where you can sell the same thing to satisfied customers profitably, right? Then you start to get to scale. And for us, one of the struggles was understanding that the first sort of enterprising, really, really creative, iterative salesperson may not be a great sales leader or cultivator of people or establisher of process. So one of our early salespeople is a magical salesperson, but what he's not is good as setting up a methodical process. He wants to change everything every day and constantly iterate. Works great when you're an independent contributor. It's havoc when you have 20 direct reports. So I think it's important to understand the different skill sets of the first person who can set up a process versus someone who iterates a process versus someone who coaches or trains a process about getting a product to market. really different skill
So
sets.
again,
I
for you,
think.
it all comes down to getting the right people in place.
For the right job at the right time. Right now, we're a data-driven organization that has 90 salespeople. It's a different process than when it's 3 of us trying to get the 20th customer, the 30th, 40th. It's a different process.
There's another element of this where there comes a tipping point where you are not having to push the product as hard into the customer, and it's starting to get pulled through. And that's when you know that what you designed as a solution is a very good fit to a problem on the other side, and then it's being pulled through. And many things have to come together. So that it has to be an important problem on the other side. It has to be owned by someone that has a budget, and then you have to be viewed as a successful firm, because as a young tech firm, it's very hard to get into large organizations. But when you get to that tipping point, it's being pulled through instead of being pushed, and you can feel it as a firm.
Okay, Amanda, I wanted to ask you, it's for many businesses, the journey to really scaling up means changing the nature of the company and the product. And I know that's what happened at Jellyvision, that you started off in one direction and had to pivot. Tell us a little bit what you learned in that process.
Well, everyone, I think that there's something really glorified about pivoting, but for us, we were going to die if we didn't change.
Just remind us what Jellyvision was originally.
We were originally a company that made games on CD-ROMs, these things that held data that you put into a computer. When those things died, so too did our business model. And so we wildly had to change, and we went from a hits-driven B2C gaming company to a B2B enterprise SaaS company. So pretty major change. It really was. Games were fun, but then we got into health insurance, which was our calling. But the reality is we were trying to find a way where we could provide real value, where we could own IP and create a recurring business model. We just weren't able to do it sustainably in games at the time.
Okay, but tell us about what was that pivoting like? I mean, what was the realization like that you had to pivot, and then how did you actually do it?
I'm going to be really honest. We more or less shut down most of the company. There's not some great story where we were able to save everything. We utterly went from 70 people to 10 people so that we could retrench, build all new software. It was almost a restart. It wasn't a subtle click. It was a 180. And when there's a 180, all the momentum you have doing what you do in part A is utterly different. So I would call it a rebirth more than a pivot.
Okay, well, let me put it this way. What were the characteristics of the 10 people who were able to stay on and then make the new business?
We went from incredibly talented game designers who stayed incredibly talented game designers back to a core team of people who could do 3 or 4 jobs. We rebooted back to startup days, where, by the way, you're not only an incredible designer, you also are a project manager, and you take out the trash on Tuesdays. We went back to the days where you have no affordability for having a vertical expertise. You need to carry 3 or 4 bags at all times. And that was the core team we went down to be able to re-platform, completely relaunch, figure out our business development process. It was that. You go back to those multi-hit players, multi-talented players.
But I mean, that's a very dramatic story. But presumably, every business has, there is a path that they didn't choose to go down for whatever reason. Jay, what was your story?
So ours was less dramatic, so
Yes.
I can't top that
Yes,
one. But, so I would think of it as more as a sailboat, tacking, constantly adjusting to the wind, but generally heading in the right direction. So we were more. That would be more.
You're getting some
analogy.
great analogy for
Yeah.
sailing,
Yeah.
basketball, movies, baking.
Right.
People are you'll have a wider audience, a sports audience.
Yes.
Well, and you also, people think and talk in stories.
Yeah.
But that's how I see it. We had to tack constantly, and there were a lot of dead ends that didn't get realized. But as long as you can contain it as a financial problem, and you have adequate money, you can say, well, I lost $1 million here or a few $100,000 here in bad development, so you've got to make up time. But I never wanted to end up on that branch where you have this moment where you're saying, I'm really far out on this branch that's in the wrong direction, and I can't make my way back. I don't have the resources, I don't have the credibility. So that never happened. And we developed a collective skill at being very honest with each other, saying, this is going to head down a bad path. So lots of tacks, but
did you was that a sense? Sorry, just one thing. Was that sort of your intuition, or was that or calculated risk, or was it more that you experimented in a small way and that failed?
It was probably more of the calculated risk, because we didn't. I wish we had more resources to experiment, but you just never do. But what you're doing is you're trying to solve an anticipated customer problem, just so you become more relevant to them. remember, the more of the problem you solve on the customer side, the more likely your chance of being pulled through. And sometimes you get it wrong. Like we got certain problems that we thought they had, and yes, they did have them, but they really didn't, want to solve them at that stage, and that led to, development cycles that went sideways. So we had a good bit of that, but then we just became much better at solving sort of the central issue.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I think is really important, and I don't know if you guys would agree, is the biggest challenge are the pivots that you didn't take. And one of the toughest challenges of a CEO is to say no, because you have all the resources that you can do anything. And as you're starting to scale up, the world is your oyster and you can do all of these things, but the most successful people are still very narrow and very focused as they scale, and they build off of that as opposed to try to cover the water.
There are a lot of shiny objects that will look like quick revenue, and people will take them. Someone will say, why don't you just build this for me and I'll pay you when you need the money, and you do it. And before you know it, you've ended up with essentially spaghetti code. So your code doesn't make sense for anyone, and then that doesn't scale. We're talking about scaling people. Well, you have to scale the product too. In our case, thanks to a very disciplined tech team, we today serve 600 global companies, like the largest companies in the world, off a single code base, one code line. And I'd say what took down most of our competitors in the early days is they allowed the code to branch off, and at some point you're looking at a massive rewrite of the whole thing, and that's problematic.
Say to go back to say, what is the advice about the successful pivot is you have to think about what's at the fulcrum. And as long as what is at the fulcrum is what your company is uniquely great at, what your true core competency is. For us, it was an interface. So we completely changed industries, but for us, the interface was still at the core. It would be a mistake to say, well, we're selling into this channel, we've just built a channel, so now we're going to pivot to sell a bunch of other things into this channel, if in fact what you're really good at is quality assurance testing, for example. So I think a successful pivot is at its roots honoring what you uniquely do well as a company, as a team, as a brand, as a product, and staying true to that versus just chaotic opportunism.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to pivot to the ending now because our time is up. It's been a great discussion of baking and movies and basketball and sailing and some entrepreneurship along the way. So my thanks to our panel, Michael Alter, Amanda Lannert, and Jay Shekhawat. For more research, analysis, and commentary, visit us online at review.chicagobooth.edu and join us again next time for another Big Question. Goodbye.